Yeah.
Okay, now it's being recorded. Cool.
I'll email it to Elizabeth afterwards.
Sorry?
Okay, Ralph Litzinger is trying to get in too. Okay, he's coming back in a moment. So I think all the people who messaged, I'm just checking my messages here. Sala was here, so I'll send her a note. Elizabeth, did you see anyone else that was here?
Maybe it was just other trolls. I don't know.
Does anyone remember what they
anyone.
said? I mean, I know that there was some like profanity about things that they were doing to themselves.
Yeah, a bunch of N-words.
They were like sharing screen of a
Klan rally.
Yeah.
Hey, Elizabeth.
Hi,
Hey.
Elizabeth.
Hey, everybody. That was disorienting. I'm so sorry
Yeah.
that happened.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I don't know. Caitlin, you were on some early ones where we thought we were going to get Zoom bombed. Like I remember in the early days of the pandemic, there was like all these articles circulating about, did you just see what happened or are you just now joining?
No, I tried to join the earlier one and I didn't get the fresh link until just now. Did you just get bombed?
Yeah, some homophobic white nationalists just bombed us. I think that's who they were. There was at least 3 of them.
Oh, God.
Gross.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the first one I've witnessed. Oh, I'm so sorry. How is everybody doing?
Maybe we can take a collective deep breath in here in our personal Zoom meeting.
Fan, do you want to start? Because you were just talking about your work as someone started harassing you.
Yeah, I was told that my voice sounded hot or something. That's what I was called. Yeah. Well, I was just talking about my background in cultural studies, and I'm working on a new book called Trimerica, looking at the entanglement of the 2 so-called superpowers. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
Well, I think I just experienced a rush of adrenaline and relief. How's everyone else doing? Anyone feeling vulnerable? I was for a moment.
I'm feeling motivated, actually.
Yeah, amen.
Yeah.
I'm, doing medical history, but I'm really interested in folks into technology studies, especially related to the Zoom bombs. And like, I'm curious, like the hacking that they do, because we couldn't mute them or anything. So that's where like they hacked and became the hosts, not just participants who saw the meeting ID and joined.
Yeah, I was muting them as I figured out who they were, but it was like playing whack-a-mole. I muted one and then another one popped out. Did it, like, I think it'd be interesting to try to capture this moment for folks. Like, so Sala, you were online. What do you remember about this minute and 30 seconds that just happened?
Well, a fan was talking, and then suddenly, like, these voices started saying really nasty things, together with the screen boxes with names popping up but no images, and then in the middle was this what looked like a meme of sort of some.
Do we know Matthaus?
Yeah.
It was. Okay. I took my headset off because the language was just so horrible. So
I didn't hear it. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought didn't mean to cut you off. When I came in, all I saw, like, I guess I came in right after it started, so I saw like this. I thought somebody was playing a music video. Like I had no idea what was going on, and then all of a sudden, yeah, it was very disorienting and interesting to come in at that moment, because you all just looked horrified. I didn't know what was going on. Yeah, but. Goodness gracious.
So Matthias, and for those who weren't here a few moments ago on the other link, we just got Zoom bombed by people who appeared to be homophobic white nationalists. So we're just kind of taking a moment to process.
Is it possible to avoid that through things like a waiting room?
Yeah, so since we hadn't had any problems, I disabled all of that because it you know, things were just going smoothly and we hadn't had any issues, and we've been doing this for like 2 months. So I was just seeing all those extra things to click as getting in the way. But yeah, I think from now on we will.
This has also been like a public thing, so there's sometimes new names every week. So it's kind of hard to moderate in that way, but
it somehow just seemed to be like speaking volumes to the fact that this was the topic that we were discussing, and then immediately we got bombed. Like just so it's what a terrible time we're living, like, seriously, in so many ways.
Yeah.
Even more so because I saw this the reading group on Facebook, and all the information coming out with Facebook being a public forum for white nationalists. So I'm just curious, like what search words did they type in? You know, like this is this is pretty profound.
Yeah.
yeah, Facebook.
So
Yeah,
maybe migrate.
Yeah, this was also my first time that I experienced Zoom bombing. I've read about it and heard about it, but I never experienced it. But I've heard that Microsoft Teams can be a little bit safer, maybe, or Google Hangouts in case you would want to maybe move to a different platform. I've heard that. So Google Hangouts and Microsoft Teams. But
Yes,
yeah.
Yeah, it's still just a matter of like where to circulate it in a way that doesn't invite further instances of this. Well, should we maybe move?
Yeah, let's I think go ahead and do the work. I think, you know, these articles that you've offered us, Antoine, both the stuff that you've written and stuff by some of your colleagues, you know, is super important right now, and I think it's calling attention not only to the present crisis, but, you know, all these ongoing processes of underemployment, housing insecurity, inadequate access to healthcare that aren't really new, but grounded in these long legacies of structural marginalization, both for communities of color and queer communities are the two that you kind of focus on. So thank you for making this knowledge at a moment when, you know, clearly that moment of symbolic violence that we all just experienced in various kinds of ways, like, speaks to the importance of this knowledge, and also how difficult it can be to make this knowledge when, you know, there's threat of death on the streets from cops, when there's threat of death from a virus that's circulating in communities and having disproportionate impacts. But also, yeah, this community of hate and symbolic violence that's ever ready to. I'm reminded of Bourdieu, who talked about the realm of discussion. So there's forces that act to try to squelch certain critiques, and I think we just experienced a moment where, you know, people trying to be savvy with tech and penetrate a realm of discussion, like, you know, here it's a small group of us just trying to have a conversation, and you're making dangerous knowledge, which is so important. So thank you. And I just first wanted to offer it up to invite you to say some stuff about your broader work and how this fits in with it. Elizabeth has some questions too, so we're both gonna kind of you know, ask questions and try to facilitate dialogue.
Okay, yeah. Again, thank you all for having me, and thank you for sitting with the piece. It was cathartic. It allowed me to sort of branch out from my dissertation research to more contemporary events and further highlight my dissertation research. And specifically the group that I mentioned in the piece, CalPEP, the California Prostitutes Education Project. They're the focus of the chapter, the dissertation chapter I'm currently writing. And they were pretty ignored during the height of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and early 90s for multiple reasons, especially given that, you know, the misinformation of AIDS being framed as a gay white disease, and the majority of resources in the Bay Area going towards gay white male communities at the time. And CalPEP was in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, isn't too far from San Francisco General Hospital's AIDS wards. And they are doing this grassroots organizing. And they continue to be overlooked despite one of, and I have to give her credit, I didn't mention it in the blog piece, but this one physician, Constance Wolfsey, she was the first female physician at the AIDS clinic, San Francisco's AIDS clinic, along with Paul Volberding, Marcus Conant, Don Abrams, Jay Levy, and a bunch of other physicians. But she came to their defense after a bunch of newspaper articles claiming that sex workers were infecting heterosexual men. And so she's like, these claims are unscientific, and this creates a false narrative, and it increased the stigma and marginalization of sex workers. You know, they were already facing police harassment. They have financial precarity, housing insecurity, things like that. And Constance Wolfsey, you know, she was I think she was in her early 40s at the time, white woman. She died of cancer in the 1990s. But she was like, you know, these are false claims, and we need to find a way to mitigate this information. And she reached out to another sex workers organization, which is called Coyote, abbreviated for Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics. And Coyote had been around since 1973, and they focused primarily on decriminalizing sex work. Where they failed was addressing HIV and AIDS. So the Black members of Coyote became distant from them and ended up creating CalPEP, because they're like, you know, the majority of women affected by the disease is Black, and Coyote is majority white, and they're ignoring HIV and AIDS. So we need to create our own organization. And Coyote understood that. And when Dr. Wolfsey went to Coyote, Wolfsey recommended the women who were creating CalPEP. And so that was the medical lens through which CalPEP operated, whereas they did the street outreach and Wolfsey did the medical research, and published a bunch of, she was interviewed a bunch of times and published a bunch of material sort of highlighting sex workers' disease susceptibility and not reinforcing the scapegoating narratives. But that's where I'm at right now with it, in addition to CalPEP later becoming a nonprofit organization, getting funding from various organizations. One organization that they received funding from was the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in 1987. The grant that they received allowed them to purchase a mobile van. And with that van, they drove in these poor communities throughout the East Bay, dispensing condoms, clean needles, AIDS informational brochures, and even going into crack houses where women are exchanging drugs for sex. Things like that, and offering this information. And, you know, because they were founded by former sex workers, they knew the culture and the language in which to speak to these women. So they created what they called a hot and sexy safe sex quiz, whereas women would take time out of their day, and sometimes women's customers and even their pimps, they'd all come and learn AIDS Information 101 in exchange for money. If you answer a certain number of questions correct, you receive $100. Second and third place, you'd receive a certain number of condoms. You know, different things like that to compensate them for their time, because time is money. But that's the frame that I'm working with right now, which wasn't obvious in that blog piece.
Fascinating, Antoine.
Sorry, that was a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great.
I suck at elevator speeches.
So I've got a lot of questions, but other folks should feel free to jump in too. And one, you know, one thing that you brought out in the blog post was the colorblind reportage of the AIDS crisis, and following Evelynn Hammonds, how racism was buried alongside race. And I'm reading this thinking of Dorothy Roberts' work, you know, showing that race is at its foundation a political construct rather than a biological phenomena. I feel like a lot of the articles in the reading today sort of speak to that. And yeah, if you could say something about how do we deal with race in these realms of epidemiology and in this post colorblind moment where, you know, race has been unmasked not as a biological construct, but it's racism as we just experienced. I'm interpreting that as white nationalism. Like, you know, it's so persistent and ever present. So how do we think about this?
Yeah, definitely. I think it harkens back to the Hippocratic oath of do no harm, which hasn't necessarily been lived up to when it comes to vulnerable communities. And we see over time, you know, the article on the 1918 influenza epidemic, you know, and the justifications back to slavery, you know, whether it's, oh, Black people respond to yellow fever differently, so that makes them fit for, you know, slave labor. And if you know, when it came to sickle cell anemia, it's like, oh, Black people have inferior genes to white people, things like that. So, but yeah, and especially with the AIDS crisis, the colorblind approach, something that I'm also working through right now, it's sort of mentioned in that article that organizers failed to convey messages with their target audiences, their target populations, because they were in denial. You know, up until I'd say as late as 1988. Organizations in Oakland, San Francisco, New York, Seattle, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, all reported, you know, poor, working class, Black, Latino people said that AIDS was a gay white disease. So, you know, why are you bothering us with this information? I'm not gay, I'm not white, so I'm not susceptible to infection. And that had to do a lot with, you know, media representation, the lack of Black physicians and Black AIDS patients on newspaper magazines covers, on TV shows, etc. And so I feel like that was placated through the colorblind approach. But it's also, as Hammonds points out, you can't let the Black media off the hook either. Mm-hmm. You know, Jet, Ebony, Essence, the National Medical Association, you know, they failed to take AIDS up as a serious threat for Black people as well, or up until around the same time, 1986, 1987. And by that time, Black people represented 1 in 4 AIDS cases.
And I looked up Hammonds too. You know, this was written by a PhD student back in the day, and now she's the dean of Harvard College. So it felt like kind of reading your blog post alongside this piece. You know, I'm imagining your future. This piece has an amazing line. How we think about disease determines who lives and dies, and she goes into those attempts to sort of cordon off different populations as biological entities and unveils it. And I think that the way that she and you track how these lack of certain data, you know, there's underreporting of certain kinds of deaths, and I think we see this today. You know, some folks are able to get first in line in terms of medical care. Others are dying at home. And do you want to talk at all about these sort of echoes of history in the present that you see around us?
Yeah, actually, one of the long studies of this, or longest examples of this, has been, I hate to use him as an example, but Tony Fauci. Recently, he went on and said, you know, black and brown people aren't answering the phone from the CDC doing their AIDS data tracking. So he sort of victim blamed them, saying that, you know, well, we can't reach them because they aren't responding to us. And in the 1980s, Tony Fauci was one of the chief medical examiner, epidemiologists at the time, who made similar claims. And that also factors into that colorblind approach, because, you know, in a bunch of interviews that he did, that Richard Cason, who was at UC San Francisco, but now I think he's at Hopkins, if I'm not mistaken. He's one of the leading epidemiologists in HIV and AIDS, and he has been for over 30 years. They mentioned in these epidemiological reports that when reaching out to potential Black participants, they reported they couldn't participate in clinical trials because if they missed work, they'd be fired. They lacked transportation because clinical trials were far away from where they lived. A lot of women reported that they needed childcare services in order to participate in clinical trials, but those aren't provided either. So they forego these trials for survival methods. You know, I can't miss work. Same reason why a lot of Black people and brown, a lot of poor people in America in general don't vote, because they work, you know, in the service sector, and you can't miss a day in states and counties where there's limited voting polls. So you have to just go to work. You know, you're not getting that time off, or you don't know that you can get that time off to go vote. You know, lack of education, lack of resources. And so I think that shows sort of that lineage. We can follow Anthony Fauci from 1985 to 2020 with AIDS and COVID and their similar responses, sadly. And I don't mean to pick on him, I swear.
I have a quick question for the whole group, just to, like, so I can think about how I can contribute to this conversation as effectively as possible. Antoine and I study the history of medicine. What are y'all's backgrounds? I don't know, like you've touched on so many things, Antoine, just now, of the history of medical racism, and it just, every time I think about this, the nuance and the layers of like harm. I mean, coming from the history of medicine background, you think of the ways that Black and brown bodies have been, for example, like thought to be more resistant to pain. You know, there's so many different ways in which Black and brown bodies can't get access to care. But then I hadn't even thought of like the phone calls and how that's another layer because of different, you know, currents of American history and the way that, I don't know, Tony Fauci has been socialized. Like there's just so many barriers and so many little ways. It was a really, really inarticulate rant that I just went on. All I'm saying is like the history around that we have, I think that I have a very specific idea of what we're talking about here. I'm curious, what is y'all's background?
Maybe a time effective way would be to share like in the chat, whoever wants to. Do you mean like in terms of our disciplines or research?
Yeah, in terms of your disciplines, like it's been really interesting the last couple of years realizing how specific our I guess thought processes when approaching these questions, they are shaped by our disciplines to a certain extent. So yeah, I'm just curious if y'all don't mind dropping that in the chat, and then I'll give it back to Antoine.
And I could quickly summarize. So very interdisciplinary crews. We've got artists, we've got anthropologists, we've got media studies people, awesome. Geographers, STS crew. Yeah, I'm probably leaving lots of things out, but that's a general. Great. Yeah. maybe specifically engaging with ACT UP, since that's one of the organizations that you talk about in your piece. I think it's interesting. I mean, ACT UP is such an unruly and complicated formation. You know, in many ways, pioneering tactics later used by Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter, like insisting sort of on a leaderless, amorphous group. And you know, some of the folks involved in the movement back in the day have told me that there was kind of a central tension between folks who are often white, who were chanting, you know, drugs into bodies, clinical trials now, get me a cure, and other folks who were interested in broader questions like who's getting AIDS, how and why. And for me, it's interesting that of the ACT UP groups that have lasted, it's the Philly chapter that persists, and in many ways a movement that used to be dominated by white folks. Now it's leaders from the African American community that are kind of shaping the activist agenda. So I was just curious to hear you say a little more about ACT UP and how this fits within the broader story that you're telling.
Yeah, that's another part that I'm digging into right now as well, and especially in Philadelphia. It's one historian, Dan Royals. He has a book coming out on Black AIDS activism in Philadelphia, and he points out the tension between the Philly chapter of ACT UP and this local organization called BEBASHI, Blacks Educating Blacks About Sexual Health Issues, BEBASHI. But I believe BEBASHI was founded in '84, if I'm not mistaken, and there was a tension over local resources. And once a lot of Black members who joined ACT UP, they mentioned being alienated because, like you mentioned, and this was not just in Philly, this was in New York, this was in the Bay Area, because the ACT UP San Francisco ended up splitting into two factions, into ACT UP SF and ACT UP Golden Gate. And a lot of this was around, not all of it, but a huge part of it was around, as you mentioned, you know, we want drugs into bodies, they're volunteering for clinical trials. But when you look at the long history of the Black experience in American medicine, there hasn't really been a point where Black people have trusted the medical field. So, and you know, AIDS is identified a decade after the Tuskegee experiment revelations. So a lot of, and I noticed, you know, you guys have Warwick Anderson on next week, which seems like it's gonna be really exciting. He has a great article in the American Journal of Public Health around 89 or 90 on ways in which, I forget which Western European country he used as a case study, but he showed how, you know, they had basically made needle exchange programs, for example, state-sponsored. But that didn't happen here, and he used New York as an example there. And he said, you know, he believes that a lot of the people who are dying are Black and brown, and that's a reason why they aren't making needle exchange policies legal. And that's sort of away from ACT UP and everything, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to frame all of this into the whole drugs into bodies versus, you know, we need the medical field to give us a reason to trust them. They aren't meeting us on our levels. And again, I think that even goes back to the colorblind approach, because it's like they're reaching out and saying, well, we tried and Black and brown people don't care, so, oh well. And that's sort of what it's coming down to. And that's what it's coming down to right now with COVID. That's what it came down to with HIV and AIDS. But I just feel like there needs to be some level of cultural competency. You know, like that's why I mentioned, I use CalPEP as an example in the piece, because, you know, they were run by former sex workers and they interacted with sex workers. You know, it's like they trust us. And I actually have an interview, it's not in the notebooks I have right here, but the founder of CalPEP, she gave an interview and she mentioned that a young lady walked up to her and said, hey, a doctor told me I have AIDS, what does that mean? And that's all. They just told people, you know, especially sex workers, you're HIV positive or you have AIDS, and so be it. You know, they didn't necessarily give them any information on how they contracted the virus, what actions, you know, render one susceptible to infection, things like that. You know, there wasn't any cultural language embedded into ways in which health professionals interacted with a lot of poor and working class people, especially sex workers.
Would it be okay to follow up on that one? I've really enjoyed this discussion, and Antoine, I really appreciate the work that you do. It sounds so super valuable and important. And I have an endorsement and a question. And the endorsement is that I wrote a book about the conduct of clinical trials, with the specific case study being in Sri Lanka, but also reviewed a lot of the literature about clinical trials across different low-income countries. And it seemed like the narrative about the development of their clinical trials, the randomized controlled trial method, being it's a Western hero story of medical development. This is how it's sold. And then, okay, if there have been so in the narrative, like if you have sort of missteps of that narrative, if you will, there are ethical controversies, and that's when then the location or the Tuskegee or trials on non-white bodies are kind of brought in. But these locations, for example, in the global south across African countries, are never situated as contributing to the knowledge production. So either there are sites where controversies take place, ethical malpractices, and I don't dismiss that at all, but I'm alluding to a kind of second blind spot there, that there are only locations where bad things happen, and never actually the originators or knowers or experts who contributed as equal partners to the European scientists in these medical collaborations. So there's a kind of scientific expertise scrubbing out as well, which I find deeply troubling. And so I tried to put a little bit of that in my book in terms of reviewing, like, yes, the circulation of knowledge across different locations beyond Europe has taken place throughout the history of medical research, and not just something that trials have emerged in low-income countries like in the past 20 years, which is often the narrative. And so that was the endorsement. The question that I have is that now we see in global health research, and this was initiated from the AIDS activist movements all across the world, a kind of inclusion or demand to include community groups into different medical endeavors in order to bring that kind of culturally relevant knowledge. And there seems to be a very strong kind of ethical demand to be inclusive and bring communities, and this community engagement is seen to have all sorts of positive values. And I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not suggesting these things myself, whereby they make research more ethical because it's culturally more relevant, it can get people's buy-in, translate into empowerment and more equal relationships and so on, to the point that sometimes it seems to turn into almost like an appropriation. And so without the very critical thinking that, in fact, the way in which it's done, though for the best of intentions, actually can create harm or become tokenistic or co-optive and so on. So I'm sort of talking from having been related to or studying engagement programs. I've seen that they deliver this discourse of a promise of more equal inclusion, but yet they also have a lot of problems. So perhaps I was thinking, have you taken a sort of critical line to this and thought, what is there something lost when community action groups then get taken over by large corporations or global health researchers or institutions, and what is something gone? Does something go missing from the ground up action when they become part of these neoliberal arrangements? Thanks.
Sorry. Thanks for that, seriously. And please, if you don't mind typing the name of your book in the chat, I'd love to read it. But as far as, I would say yes, there's a lot at stake when corporations take over, but also because I don't look at it from an international perspective intentionally, because when I was studying, you know, the historiography of HIV and AIDS, a lot of white white-led community-based AIDS organizations, they dealt with their susceptibility, and then when it came to Black people, they went internationally to Africa, as if Black people weren't dying in the United States. So for that reason alone, I'm avoiding the international perspective intentionally, for disclosure. But also, when it comes to these corporations engaging with these organizations, I think there's a lot at stake for various reasons, though, and it depends on the leverage that the community organizations have. For example, you know, and I think this piggybacks off of, I think it was Evan's question, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, when you brought up Philadelphia and ACT UP. A lot of grassroots white organizations, they worked closely with the physicians. A lot of them, and there were a lot of, in San Francisco, for example, I can't say elsewhere, but I know, for example, in San Francisco, many of the physicians were gay white men as well. So they shared similar cultural values, they hung out in similar places. So there was some sort of connection prior to HIV and AIDS. When the San Francisco AIDS Foundation was created, it was created by physicians, mostly gay white male physicians and gay white AIDS organizers. And they came together with the San Francisco Department of Public Health to create the San Francisco AIDS Foundation. But other organizations like CalPEP, for example, they had to change their name in grant applications from the CDC because they were denied funds for having, they say it was because of the word prostitute being in the name of their title. And in other instances, they tried to work around the guidelines for the grants in which they received that sort of limited their organizing, because they'd receive funds and they'd be able to, you know, buy needles and set up needle exchange sites throughout the Bay Area, but they'd be bombarded by police officers as well who said, you know, you don't have permits, this isn't legal here. You know, like I mentioned in the Warwick Anderson piece, a lot of needle exchange programs, they face backlash and harassment from elected officials and local police departments as well. But other organizations, when they interact with corporations, it's kind of tough. It's kind of tough because, like I said, it depends on the leverage. Recently, I think a few months ago, I think in April, CalPEP received a grant from Chevron to purchase another van that has mobile showers. So now, once COVID is, you know, once people are allowed to go back outside, they plan on going into these same communities in these homeless encampments, which are growing rapidly in Oakland especially, to allow people to come in, take a shower, and they're looking for clothes donations to give to homeless people as well. You know, so Chevron gave them the money, but they don't have any oversight. So like I said, I guess it just depends on leverage.
Part of what I think you do really deftly in this piece is show kind of the small violences that are happening. So the holes being poked in the condoms, the way that prosecutorial discretion is used to prosecute Black men and women, but not white folks for using crack cocaine. And I mean, there's a way that you could use a biopolitical lens to understand, you know, making some live and letting others die. But I also think there's an opportunity to offer something else. The book Habeas Viscus takes Agamben and Foucault to task for not having a cogent theory of race. And, you know, there's a specificity to the biopolitical regimes we're seeing here, and maybe it's a regime that's yet unnamed. I mean, Alexander Wheelhay talks about racializing assemblages, doing the work of rendering certain bodies killable. So I was just wondering if you might say some more about these small violences that you're seeing with this prosecutorial discretion, and you know, the acts, you know, now, and maybe also historical perspective on the current moment. Like now it's hyper visible, the fact that Black men are getting shot dead on the streets, and that harassment like what we just experienced is taking place. So how do you situate this all in history too?
Yeah, you mentioned some good theoretical threads to examine it, but the main one that I've been using is Bembe's theory of necropolitics, the decision, you know, deciding who gets to live and who gets to die. And that's even with the contemporary moment. And like I've said, you know, I swear I'm not trying to pick on Fauci, but you know, them making him the chief physician of the nation and COVID, he's the easy person to, you know, to analyze. You know, you're a physician, do no harm. You need to, it's I don't know the right word, but it's just disgusting that people continue to ignore these health determinants that render people susceptible to these diseases. You know, malnutrition, underemployment, housing insecurity, et cetera, et cetera. And when it comes to the prosecutorial stuff, you know, and we have the gentleman as the vice president right now, and knowing how the AIDS epidemic that he allowed in his state when he was governor, because he believed that, you know, Christianity could convert people and, you know, mitigate the AIDS epidemic. And now he's the head person speaking on COVID in terms of the cabinet, Agent Orange's cabinet. I think that's a lot of historical similarities, you know, and I just think it's in bad faith to ignore these parallels.
Is it okay if I jump in here? Antoine, thank you so much for being here. I love this piece, and I'm so sorry that I was running behind schedule. So I'll look forward to catching up in the first half of the recording. I was struck as I was reading your work, and I was recalling something that American Studies scholar Natalia Molina wrote some years back. And I actually pulled the quote from some of my teaching notes, and she was writing about public health initiatives in Los Angeles specifically. But in the quote, she writes, issues of race, class, and gender were considered in all aspects of health officials' work, from identifying and defining problems to developing preventative healthcare programs to handling outbreaks. Disease itself becomes defined so much more according to sociocultural beliefs as by biologically deterministic explanations. And she's really talking about, you know, and critiquing the embedded racism of public health initiatives in Los Angeles at the turn of the century. And I think the thing that I had rolling around as I was, you know, recalling Molina's work as I was reading yours, and thinking also about that podcast episode from the 1619 where they talk about the founding of I think Medicare and Medicaid, and again the sort of the bedrock of racism and sexism within the very foundations of this kind of medical initiatives. And so I guess the question that I wanted to ask for you was, on the one hand, I love that you're looking at you know, funding and engaging these programs that are taking direct initiatives with people, and at the same time, I was also wondering what you thought about undermining the bedrock of racism in STEM, specifically medicine, medical curricula. Are you expressly contending with that in portions of your dissertation? If so, how? What are your kind of thoughts on that, just in terms of what's in the books or not in the books? What makes it to curricular training, and who and what doesn't?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. Seriously. Not just in medical curriculum, but I'm also looking at it in the historiography of AIDS and AIDS activism. So, a lot of the history books on AIDS activism almost completely render the Black experience invisible, especially the bestsellers. There's very little mention of Black AIDS patients or the Black AIDS experience. And in medical curriculum, I'm not looking at it right now, to be completely honest. My intention is to look at it at the top of next year, because bye Silent, thank you for joining. At the top of next year, because at the moment, I am scheduled to teach in March, first year medical students at UC San Francisco, a class called Race, Racism, and Medicine. Looking at the history of these things to sort of get them to not have whatever implicit biases that they may have, ignoring these things, especially now. Like, I plan on using contemporary material, because there are so many accounts where, poor people of color, I think there's even some on poor white people as well, going into the hospital, and nurses and doctors telling them, oh, it's just a cough, or it's just a common flu, or, the whole debate on who gets to use a respirator. And it's primarily poor people being rendered disposable. So I do plan to look at that, but I have not done a lot of critical engagement with that work yet.
I'd be really interested to hear more about that, Antoine, because something that studying the history of medicine, something that's so wild to me is that physicians today, from what I understand, and like you're doing that work, so I'd really love to hear about how like medical students are trained. From what I understand, there's only like one semester of any kind of like training in implicit bias that any given physician is going to have. So you hear all these stories of like one just dumb anecdote that sticks out in my mind was like a physician talking to a Black woman whose child was obese and trying to like empathize, being like, I get it, like it's hard at the end of the day to like make healthy food, like just the inability to understand that you have completely different life experiences. You can't just like have a one-to-one. Anyways, so I'm so glad that you're doing that work, and I'm really interested to hear more about like, yeah, what kind of training are physicians getting these days, because they just seem totally unequipped to deal with that kind of stuff.
What's funny, Liz? Like you said, a lot of them, they have one semester. So the class that I'm teaching is a mini course. It's even less than a semester. So there's 3 mini courses, and they're 2.5 weeks each. So I guess that comes up to 8 weeks, and UCSF is on a quarter system. So, the mini courses for medical education is less than a quarter. So I plan to, overwhelm them, but it's volunteer based for the medical students to sign up, and their rounds are flexible so that they don't use their rounds as an excuse not to attend the courses. But yeah, it's gonna be tough trying to squeeze and not overwhelm them with reading 2 books a week or something like that. Just a couple articles, and we'll meet 2 or 3 times a week. So yeah, I have time to sort this out, but I'm looking forward to it, and I'm up for the challenge.
That's so disappointing, because the stuff that you're teaching them, it's baked into everything that they do, and that's so wild to me.
And that even harkens back to slavery, like Deirdre Cooper Owens in her book Medical Bondage, Marie Jenkins Schwartz in her book Birthing a Slave, a couple others, they point out, the pain assessment tests, you know, when the foundings of American gynecology being practiced on Black women, and they weren't giving any anesthetics. You know, they weren't given nitrous oxide, ether, typical anesthesia, none of these things that, you know, alleviates pain. And that's sort of embedded in, I think it was 2015, where University of Virginia medical students published a paper saying Black people have a higher tolerance for pain than white people. And that deals all the way back to, you know, the 1840s. You know, these are all connected. And even some would even make the case that, you know, the pain assessments from slavery are embedded in the current opioid crisis.
Absolutely.
Because white people are being overprescribed medication and Black people are being underprescribed pain medication. So I feel like all of these things are related.
Yeah, and that the physicians aren't being taught that history. Yeah, it just kind of snowballs into the situation that we have today. Like, yeah, I wonder what we need to do as educators, as historians, to like try and shoehorn some history into medical education. Yeah, but yeah, that's awesome you're teaching that class.
I feel like the blog series that, you know, provided the platform for me to publish this piece. I think things like that are helpful because they aren't behind paywall and they're easily accessible. Like I have a bunch of friends and family members who aren't in college right now, or who have never went to college. Like the screen that says Albert's iPhone, that's my closest friend. He graduated from college in, I think, 2015. And I sent him the article and he's been sharing it with folks and he joined us today, you know. So I feel like making these things easily accessible, and I thank y'all for providing this platform because there's so much that I wanted to include in that piece, but I couldn't because of word count. And things like this are allowing me to just talk probably too much.
Thank you so much. And I also just wanted to celebrate this other article you gave us. I've seen a lot of comparisons to the influenza pandemic, but this piece I feel really nails it. Puts the current pandemic in perspective. You know, in 1918 there were 1 million deaths recorded, but many of those deaths weren't recorded, and it led. Part of what this article explores is the way that data weren't fully collected on many parts of the population, but also how disproportionate reporting and different ways that the disease played out led to these radical theories of the human species. So quoting a white West Virginian who claimed the influenza germ has shown that God was partial in favor of Black people. There was someone named William Pickens who countered that for whites, when Negroes die faster, it is often ascribed to their inferiority. But if spread, that proves that they are not human like the rest of us. So this piece goes on to kind of put the disproportionate numbers into perspective, looking at how in those days crowded environments might have led to earlier exposures to earlier waves of a less virulent virus, poor access to sanitation, potable water, hygiene were all part of what contributed to differential outcomes, as well as the direct impact of segregation, which might have created an unintentional cordon sanitaire. So I think you see many of those things from 1918 playing out in the current moment. And I think this is why your work is so important, is that you're reminding us that, again, this isn't an exceptional moment that we're living through, but something that has a long
history. Yeah, definitely. And that same time period, I don't mean to ignore you, Caitlin, I promise. But that same time period in which they published their piece, 1918, around the time of, you know, post-World War I, and in Baltimore, you know, they're all at Hopkins. So I think it's fitting to point out in Baltimore, where there was also huge tuberculosis issues. And, you know, I feel like all of these show that these are social diseases, you know, due to inadequate resources and overcrowding. You know, there's a great book called Infectious Fear by Sam Roberts, where he points out the tuberculosis issue in Baltimore And also, again, you know, the inadequate response from public health officials and doctors. You know, Black people at the time were labeled incorrigible. You know, and when white people got tuberculosis, there were, you know, additional clinics opened up and they were able to move elsewhere. But, you know, Baltimore was so segregated where people were overcrowded and didn't necessarily have the opportunities to social distance. You know, and the New York Times just published a piece today on COVID among Latinx people, where 40% of folks in the, I think it was 300 people in the study, 40% were identified as Latinx and 41% identified as white. But the majority of the people who contracted COVID were Latinx because a lot of them lived in poor, overcrowded communities in New York. I believe I have that right. It's in today's New York Times.
May I jump in now? Thanks, Antoine, and also thank you for this gem of an issue of Radical America. The whole thing looks amazing. And I also just wanted to maybe point towards something I'd like to hear more about in your research about vulnerability, what you phrased in the post about Black vulnerability, which might tie in a bit, I think, with this double bind of structural under-resourcing and concurrent with a pre-existing burden of stigma, and how when a minority group is burdened with a disease, the desire or maybe the reluctance to take on that fact because it then the association of racism with the disease then further burdens the group as being identified with the disease, which we are also currently seeing with COVID, with service workers and racialized service workers being associated and therefore also aggressed. What you described before about the media, the Black media being reluctant to take up the issue of HIV/AIDS in the past because of that vulnerability to burden. So just wanting to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. Good question as well. Where to start? Okay. So the vulnerability issue in terms of the Black press. I'm so sorry, Caitlin. I hadn't had breakfast. Can you please repeat your question? I'm sorry. It was sort of reflected on what what's mentioned in the piece, but also some additional information you put forward. I'm sorry. I was all over.
No worries. Just more. I guess it's a little bit of a comment and generalization of that double bind of vulnerability, of being vulnerable to once one addresses the problem of being burdened with a particular disease, that then there's also the problem of dealing with the stigma. And so when there's this coexistence of pre-existing racism that makes a group vulnerable to a disease, and then also the disease itself adds onto that, the racialization of the disease, that kind of creates this commingling of double vulnerability to stigma and disease that kind of amplify each other. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. The best example that I've come across and that I'm using as a thread throughout my dissertation is the book, The Boundaries of Blackness by political scientist Kathy J. Cohen. And The Boundaries of Blackness, the subtitle of the book is AIDS and the Breakdown of Black Politics. So in that book, Cohen traces Black leadership from the civil rights movement, the main leaders who were primarily business people and church leaders who followed respectability politics, which Evelynn Hammonds points out. And so when it came to when AIDS, she says that they fought for respectability among white Americans, that they disassociated themselves from Black people who had been marginalized by white dominant culture, specifically drug users, sex workers, the LGBTQ community. If you identified with any of those communities, you were seen as an outlier, and you were in the way of Black mobility and acceptance in dominant white culture. So by the time AIDS came around, there was hesitance from these Black leaders because they feared that if we address AIDS, then people are going to say it's a Black disease. So, you know, we are just the main argument made at the time, not everywhere though, because, I mean, not all churches, because the Black church is known historically as the main body of leadership in Black communities. But a lot of Black churches, you know, they said that AIDS was, and not just Black churches, you know, this was white churches, Latinx Catholic churches as well, that AIDS was divine retribution, you know, for immoral behavior. So that was sort of that, you know, distance from that to try to distance themselves from these so-called immoral behaviors. A better term other than vulnerability is intersectional stigma, which is what this one anthropologist uses, Michelle Tracy Berger. She has I'm sorry I'm dropping all these books, y'all, but they've been so foundational to me. Her book, Workable Sisterhood, she follows sex workers in Detroit. And the majority of them were Black. I think 2 were white and like 1 was Latinx. But she mentions that, you know, all of the women, things that they had in common, they experienced sexual trauma at young ages. They lived in poverty, unstable housing, and all of these things led them to resort to drug dependence. And to feed their drug habits, they resorted to sex work. So that's how they got into sex work. And so being sex workers, especially Black, you know, you were stigmatized for your gender and your race. And then when AIDS came around, all of these things intersected. So that's sort of where, you know, I'm trying to work through all of this, you know, these issues and bring light to, you know, I don't know, these low-income, underrepresented subpopulations being central to biomedical knowledge production, if that makes sense.
Elizabeth, you had a really interesting question or comment in the chat. Do you want to elaborate on that?
I think Anne had her hand up though.
Oh, sorry, I'm not noticing.
Well, yeah, I guess it was sort of a minor detail in the Krishnan et al. Article, I believe, where they point out that at the time of the, you know, multiple years long pandemic in the early 20th century, that it was also this time of, like, you know, social tumult, I guess, and the Great Migration from, I mean, I'm not a historian, but from the U.S. South to like the Midwest and northern states, and how, yeah, that coincided with probably, you know, many, I guess, I don't know if there were multiple riots or just like a lot of social tension, a lot of really rapid social changes, interpersonally and, you know, in terms of legislature. They mentioned that this sort of set the preconditions for some of the first civil rights demonstrations. Yeah, so it just sort of I think there's a lot of people who are experiencing the current moment as just like, yeah, you know, you hear this word unprecedented over and over again, and especially in terms of like, I guess 21st century social movements, we've never had the precondition of like mass unemployment to like set things off in a certain way. But even this, I suppose, has sort of happened before in a sense, just 100 years ago. But yeah, it was just like a brief part of that article, but I would want to understand more about the like similarities and differences.
And 1919 was also a year of unprecedented racial violence, like lynching, and it was kind of the height of Jim Crow. So yeah, it is interesting just how everything is kind of intersected exactly 100 years later.
If you Google a map of Red Summer of 1919, it might show you every city that there were race riots, mainly due to the Great Migration, Black people moving around, but it was also in the Deep South as well. But Red Summer of 1919, Black soldiers coming home from World War I in their uniforms, being seen as a threat. You know, I think they lasted, the first one was in April and it went till September, something like that, in a bunch of cities throughout the country. But there should be maps that show like red dots or hotspots for all the cities in which there were race riots.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm now mindful of, bye Elizabeth, of the fact, Antoine, that you haven't eaten breakfast. I was happy to sort of have a bit more time past the hour just because we had a delayed start, but
please.
But well, I mean, we've had now an extra 20 minutes. I don't know if there's any, or Anne, you did have maybe as the closing question.
Okay, it's not even a question. I will make it very brief as a comment. Okay. So just to go back to what Caitlin said about stigmatizing. I mean, I just recently, a colleague of mine sent a poster that was being circulated on a train from Zurich to Basel. I'm based here in Switzerland, in Zurich, and it says like Corona die größte Lüge der Welt, like Corona the biggest lie on earth. And it says that actually the pharmaceutical companies, of which many headquarters are in Basel, like Novartis and Roche, is behind the Corona, and it comes from foreigners and asylum seekers, and it's something that something like that would even circulate in a tram is very shocking. But I wanted to, going back to the Spanish flu from 1918, just something briefly about Sweden that I just recently read, how apparently the Spanish flu helped create Sweden's modern welfare state. And so as the Spanish flu was ravaging through the world, it also ravaged through a very remote city in Östersund, as it is called, and it also almost eradicated the whole city, and it was called the capital of the Spanish flu. And the reason why it spread like wildfire there is because of they had speedy railway connections, and there was malnutrition and cramped accommodations, as well as several army regiments stationed in close quarters. And because of that, the modern welfare, they're saying that the modern welfare system in Sweden is coming out of this terrible experience that they had during the Spanish flu. So I was wondering in what way we might move forward from the current pandemic, and also providing a better health for everyone, because as we see this pandemic, the current pandemic, as it was highlighted by some of you, is bringing to the fore a lot of issues that we have within society, and it's just bubbling to the surface, and in what way we might learn from it and maybe improve in the way that Sweden was able to learn from it. So I mean, this is a little off topic to the conversation, but I just thought maybe Antoine, in your work, you can say something about that.
Yeah, thanks. I'd love anyone else's opinion on that too, because honestly, I've, given the leadership, quote unquote leadership here, I'm pessimistic. However, you know, under Richard Nixon, you know, we got we got OSHA, we got Earth Day, we got the EPA, you know, so like, you know, we might get something. I don't know, you know, even with the current folks in office right now. But also I think that, and that won't even, that's not me giving full credit to them, because there was a lot of youth-led movements in the late 60s and early 70s who, you know, really forced the federal, state, and local governments to enforce legislation that enacted change. And we see that right now as well. So, you know, even if we do, I wish we get a welfare state like Sweden. But whatever we get, you know, I think that a lot of that credit belongs to the youth and the people out in the streets doing the hard work. But that was a great question. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
I really just think it's an interesting moment of political possibility where electoral politics doesn't seem to be you know, we're seeing how power moves in other ways. And, you know, if it's Trump, Biden, like if that's the kind of polls of political possibility, I think it's an incredibly pessimistic moment. But yeah, what we're seeing is organizing happening in a multitude of different kinds of ways. So I think it's a really interesting moment. There's lots of interest, sticking with electoral politics, I'm tracking lots of interesting House and Senate races. But yeah, people are realizing like that's not, there's other modes of justice. There's other modes of being political. And I think, you know, going back to ACT UP, like this is one of those movements that's reminding us, okay, yeah, maybe we need to make some kind of alliance with people like Fauci or the medical establishment, but there's ways of doing politics that subvert and circumvent and re-articulate institutionalized medicine as it's been handed down to us. So thank you for reminding us of all these important historical antecedents. And I also want to thank Elizabeth. So Elizabeth has been doing amazing behind the scenes work now for weeks, months, I think, to make this reading group happen. And Elizabeth today, yeah. Elizabeth today made this particular event happen. So thank you for the curatorial work, the behind the scenes work, the hidden labor, and yeah, thanks again to everyone for experiencing an odd so Rachel, I think you might be the only one, and Matthias, I guess too. We were Zoom bombed by some apparently white nationalist homophobes at the beginning of the call. So that's why we ended up with a new Zoom room. So thanks everyone. I feel like I'm
so sorry. I'm so sorry to hear that. I'm so sorry that happened.
Yeah, and Antoine, thanks for, you know, handling it with tact and grace. And, you know, you stepped in as the new Zoom host when Elizabeth and I were like, what do we do? So not only were you super articulate, not having eaten breakfast, but you were a masterful Zoom host that helped us evade white nationalist douchebags. I'm interested, does anyone know, can I ask Zoom who bombed us, or is there any way of going back at them with some kind of, or we just have to be evasive?
Maybe we bait them into a future meeting.
That would be fun. That would be super fun. Caitlin, do you want to do something queer and I don't know. I was thinking of reaching out to Paul Percadio too. Paul, if Paul's up for being bait.
I mean, well, I don't know about how fun that would be for Paul, but but I do really love his writing. Recent writings on the virus have been pretty great.
Well, we could also create we could create bait and not have it be a person.
Yeah, that's what I
Race and queer are in the titles. That'll be an easy way to bait them in.
Yeah. Yeah, we read Tim Dean's Unlimited Intimacy early in the pandemic, and I thought that that would be bait of some sort. But yeah, nobody showed up that day. But I think it's maybe the intersection of race and sexuality that really touches a nerve with those folks.
I think Sean and Rachel had any additional questions.
Oh yeah, I was just sort of going yes with what we were talking about before, and saying, you know, and was sort of thinking about the Krishnan kind of the closure of that piece was really to, you know, investment in restorative justice models, and I guess that made me think about a follow-up to something that we were talking about earlier about curricula and course development and really just pedagogical investment, and thinking kind of on a practical level that, you know, I mean, I'm a founding a member of a food justice nonprofit, and I'm also an academic. And the thing that kind of overlaps in my experiences of both of those realms has been that, you know, the added and additional constant work of getting people on board in investment of these things. And I teach alongside hard scientists, and I mostly teach as a gender studies and American studies trained scholar. I teach mostly to biology majors, and our students overall are, you know, fantabulous. But I do notice a lot of, you know, you are foundationally troubling the ground upon which many of them have been taught to stand, and that means work. That is work. That is labor, and so you really need resources and investment to be able to do that. So, you know, thank you for developing the course that you're developing, and just kind of as a follow-up to sort of say, we need, whether it's on the community level and investing in restorative justice models, but also just kind of thinking pedagogically in academia, at least, you know, as someone who's, you know, teaching, you know, trained elsewhere and doing interdisciplinary work, and then teaching in the hard scientists, to get students on board with that takes time and a lot of labor. And again, you're troubling some very profound and long historical waters, and you need resources and investment from senior folks, from, you know, I'm contingent faculty. It can't be grad students and contingent faculty. We really need, you know, other folks to really get behind these things. These cannot be sort of a single, you know, a single course that students will take over the course of 4 years. This needs to be seen as, you know, a serious part, an extension of teaching, you know, teaching in the hard sciences, that this is a foundational component of that. So I was just sort of kind of like, you know, how to, you know, continue that is, whether it's in our communities or in, you know, in the classrooms, is we really need folks to kind of to, you know, to amplify those kinds of courses that you're developing, and have them be, you know, longer than, you know, I think what you said was a couple of weeks. So
Definitely, that should be central to their medical education. Like, it needs to be completely redone, and not just say, hey, let's get some humanities people in here just to, you know, give them some, you know, bird feed them or whatever, and then go on about your business and take what you want from it. And that's another thing, is voluntary based. You know, it's like there's 3 different sessions, and they have to sign up for at least one, and they're trying to make it mandatory and force them to sign up for all 3. And like I said, you know, their rounds are flexible, so I don't see why they can't be. But I get, you know, it's a lot of labor as well. You know, reading a lot of material, not just reading, but comprehending, because those are 2 completely different things. And then going to do your medical work, you know, those things can be pretty arduous. But it needs to be done somehow, some way, you know, and it's not going to happen over just 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah, I think you're probably familiar, Antoine, with the work of the Do No Harm Coalition, based out of UCSF. And I think, like, I'm seeing this, I mean, I'm not really plugged into this world, but I'm seeing from my position, like the American Medical Association is having a Prioritizing Equity video series. Recently, they had this huge webinar on police brutality and COVID-19. There's also, there was an event here, UC Davis, what is it? Health Office for Health Equity, Diversity and Inclusion just had a an event on racism as a public health crisis. So like these things are being framed at sort of high level, at high levels, so that you can see, I guess, students coming into their medical training are coming into a sort of new world of what it means to do this work.
Found you've been very patient. I'm sorry.
Sorry?
I found she's been very patient. She had her hand raised a while ago.
Sorry, was it Anne?
Anne.
Or, oh, I thought Anne asked her question already. Was there?
Me? No, I didn't raise my hand. I already asked.
Oh, I raised my hand earlier, but I felt like I missed the moment already. But I was really interested in the discussion about the creation of welfare state after the 1918 Spanish flu, and what kind of lack of conditions a possibility at the moment. So one of the things I guess I could relate back to, if I may, Antoine, you mentioned earlier about your decision to focus on domestic racism, and in part because whenever issues are brought up about AIDS, the discussion shifted to Africa. And I'm kind of wondering in what ways we may think of those together in terms of racial capitalism in a global context. And I was also thinking back in the early moment of COVID-19, one argument can be made that the distant suffering in a place like Wuhan did not really trigger any actual affective response through Western media, despite the fact that it was already happening. And so perhaps there's an opening to kind of explore what we can do about that lack of attention to people of color, not just in a domestic context, but also globally.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I think it has a lot to do with intent, especially like you said, through a racial capitalism framework. Whenever, because there were people, some people, you know, they were genuinely concerned about AIDS in Africa, but they framed it through sort of like a white savior type of lens, whereas it's like they're doing some sort of charitable work when there's people in their backyards dying from AIDS. And like, by framing it through racial capitalism, I think that further illuminates the disparities in this country. And, you know, back to the point on deciding who gets to live and who gets to die, you know, that we touched on earlier as well. I'm sorry, there was something else there that you mentioned. I'm sorry, I'm a bit all over the place at this point.
Yes, in part, I lower my hand thinking that maybe we should let you go get breath.
But also,
thank you for the response.
Yeah, but also, Fan, that reminds me of, you know, and sort of with the Evelynn Hammonds point, where she mentioned whenever Africa was brought up, it was through these terrible, you know, lies, you know, catered around some weird sexual practices. But also, in Africa, you know, Evelynn Hammonds mentions, you know, the life expectancy for white people diagnosed with HIV, their average life expectancy in 1986, I believe, was 2 years. For Black people, when diagnosed, it was 19 weeks. And that points to, you know, and one of the earliest symptoms of HIV is Kaposi sarcoma, which is a bunch of skin lesions that breaks out on the body. A lot of American dermatologists ignored even looking for skin lesions on Black people because we have darker skin. The lesions are purple and bluish, and so they're a lot more obvious on white people's skin. And that's one of the earliest symptoms of HIV. You can get it at any point, you know, give or take. I'm not a physician, but I've worked with a physician who was studying AIDS. I'm pretty confident to talk about this, but if y'all hear anything off, please feel free to correct me. But give or take, quote unquote, healthy humans, we have about 1,200 white blood cells to fight off infections. Kaposi sarcoma can kick in at any point, no matter where your white blood cell count, you know, antibodies, 1,200, give or take. Pneumocystis pneumonia, which a lot of Black people died from, kicks in when your white blood cell count drops below 200. And that's why, like Hammonds mentioned, a lot of Black people were getting seen when it was life or death situations. It wasn't routine doctor visits. It was, okay, I can't work anymore. You know, I'm fatigued, I'm losing weight rapidly. I have to go get checked out now, so I might as well. And then it's like, oh, you have a rare form of pneumonia. It's called pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, PCP. And that makes you more susceptible to a bunch of other infections, you know, fungal infections, cytomegalovirus, which leads you to go blind, you know, dementia, the AIDS virus attaches to your brain, you know, and a lot of Black people were getting these things and dying in shorter amounts of time because we were not getting doctor visits earlier. And when we were, that's that whole debate, you know, life and death, who decide who gets to live and die. And not necessarily giving people proper information, you know. Back to the, I don't want to keep making book references, but that's sort of what I wanted to hint at as well, you know, when it comes to who's living and dying, when it comes to HIV and AIDS, and how they're living and dying. Because, you know, the drugs now, you know, can stop, you can't get those white blood cells back, but, you know, PrEP, pre-existing prophylaxis, it can stop your white blood cell count from dropping, you know, but even PrEP is expensive. You know, there's a bunch of Black people in the South, specifically Alabama and Mississippi, outward gay Black men who've been trying to get their hands on these, but they can't because, you know, there's like one Planned Parenthood in like a 200-mile radius and they don't have any health insurance. You know, they have inadequate health insurance. You know, and PrEP has all these, you know, it's expensive and you need good health insurance to get PrEP for free or at a discounted rate. And that ties into racial capitalism as well, I was arguing. I'm glad I found that.
Thank you. That was a great response. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks again, Antoine. This has really been informative, and yeah, thanks for sticking with us for almost 2 hours now on an empty stomach.
Oh, seriously, I needed this. Seriously, this is, you know, gratifying.
Yeah, it's important words you're writing and speaking. So keep it up.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me, and I will try to stay tuned, you know, especially next week with Warwick Anderson. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, works great. And do we want to post? Do we want to post this video? What do you think, Antoine? It's totally up to you.
I don't care. I'm gonna email it to Elizabeth, and you can do what you want with it.
Okay.
As soon as it pops up in my email.
Let's see what happens if they come after us more on Twitter and Facebook or whatever. Let's circle back and figure out what our tactics of response are going to be. Let's put it up there, and we'll. I don't know what to do if people come after us, but I think lots of folks will have our backs.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, man.
Thank you all. Seriously, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Bye.